So I just said that I changed the title of my presentation to reflect what I'm going to speak about today. And so I come at this, so I'm from the political science department, and I come from this at a very political science, sociology, social science kind of way, right? And so I would really appreciate any thoughts and comments that you might have on the hermeneutic devices that is reflected as I show the difference in Muslim women's organizations' behavior regarding polygamy, which is what I'm going to talk about. And because I'm focused on changes over time, in this chapter, I'm asking how has the hermeneutics, the organizations, right, employment of hermeneutics change over time. So I'm following two organizations and looking at the changes in which their hermeneutic the changes in their hermeneutic devices over time, right? In light of other structural reasons, okay? So while my emphasis is not on evaluating the details of their hermeneutic model, because I'm speaking solely to, this is a dissertation chapter of mine, and so I'm speaking to a social science audience, I want to show that there are changes in the hermeneutic devices, and I want to address them broadly and weave that into my argument. So that would set a context for you all in terms of my presentation. So this paper is a condensed version of my dissertation chapter where I examine Muslim women's mobilization around marriage laws from the 1930s, 1950s to the present. And in this talk, I will focus specifically around the issue of polygamy from the 1950s to the present. So before I proceed, let me provide a brief background on Islam and civil society in Indonesia. Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world, home to approximately 238 million people, of which more than 75% follow Islam. There are as almost many Muslims living in Indonesia as there are in the entire Arab-speaking world combined. Indonesia is neither a secular nor theocratic state. The official philosophical foundation of Indonesia comprises of 5 principles, of which the first is that it states the belief in the divinity of God. Okay, religion permeates the public space in various ways, and I'll be happy to talk about that later on. Indonesia recognizes 6 official state religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hindu, Buddhism, and Javanese beliefs. Okay, Indonesian civil society is among the most active in the Muslim world, and at the center of this vibrant Islamic society are 2 mass Islamic organizations, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. 75% of Indonesia's 200 million Muslims identify with either NU or Muhammadiyah. NU claims to have 35 to 40 million members, while Muhammadiyah claims to have 25 to 30 million members. And both NU and Muhammadiyah have autonomous women's organizations, Aisyah and Muslimat NU. So the main difference between the 2 organizations are their theological foundations. NU is built on the foundation of Ahli Sunnah wa Jama'ah, and which literally means, you all know what it means. And the religious canon comprises of the Quran, Sunnah, Hadith, and the traditional schools of 4 Islamic schools of thought, right? Of Islamic jurisprudence. And Muhammadiyah refers solely to the Quran and the Hadith. So the focus of my presentation are 2 Muslim women's organizations, right? Aisyah and Muslimat NU. Aisyah is affiliated to Muhammadiyah and is one of the oldest women's organizations established in 1917. And Muslimat NU is affiliated to NU and was established in 1946. Okay? So both Aisyah and Muslimat NU believes that their Islamic mission should not only consist of preaching and teaching religious knowledge, but also the delivery of services, such as providing education, healthcare, providing seed money for economic activities, and also conducting political education workshops. Aisha and Muslimat and you are also active politically. They contribute their perspectives on policy issues and are active advocates for women's rights within an Islamic framework. So these are just some of the photos of Muhammadiyah Gedong means office. And this is a Madrasa Muallimat, which is one of the young girls of Muhammadiyah's, in Muhammadiyah's family. They study as like a boarding school, Muslim boarding school. Okay, so I come to my research question, and let me lay the context a little bit. So marriage law is central to most Islamization, nationalist, and feminist projects because it intersects the private and public realm and arranges personal and social relations. Since the 1930s, Muslim women's organizations in Indonesia have mobilized for an Islamic marriage law to improve women's rights within an Islamic framework. In 1974, an Indonesian marriage law was passed. Currently, Muslim women's organizations are advocating for change to the Islamic marriage law. However, they are mobilizing for these reforms in ways that are new and puzzling. On one hand, Muslim women's organizations mobilize for equal treatment and individual rights. However, in other instances, they extol female difference and advocate for recognition based on particular identities. So both Muslimat and Aisha are vocal opponents of polygamy, unregistered marriage, and out-of-court divorce. However, their demands that women have equal rights in determining the validity and the nature of marriage and divorce appear quite paradoxical to their beliefs that men are leaders of the household and that men are responsible over wives' livelihood and welfare. So what explains these incongruities? So there are two schools of explanation. So one group of scholars explain the behavior of Muslim women's organization, that it's because it is linked, because Muslim women's organizations are embedded in male institutions, that then explains their behavior, right? And this is a scholarship emerging out of the nationalist scholarship of feminism and nationalism, that because women's movement, for them to be strategic, for them to be effective, they prefer the politics of alliance instead of the politics of autonomy. Another school of thought looks at ideological differences, right? So they look at the influence of liberalism or fundamentalism in explaining the primary determinant of behavior. And recent research scholarship on piety movements have looked at a variety of Islamic organizations, which I do in my later chapters. But in this chapter specifically, I want to look at the center, or what we call the moderate Muslim organizations, and see whether or not their changes around marriage laws have changed over time. And so this is my argument. So I did 12 months of field work in Indonesia, and I went to archives of these organizations, and I did interviews and all that. And I argue that Aisha and Muslimat NU have developed alternative methods of Quranic exegesis and evaluation of Hadith and fiqh. And I categorize these three alternative interpretations broadly. One way in which they have done so is through this choosing mechanism. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the foreground, they choose Islamic verses within the Quran that foregrounds equality. So it's an intertextual sort of mechanism. The other mechanism is the interpretation mechanism, that they use Hadith and Quranic exegesis that invokes some notion of gender equality. And the third mechanism is the application mechanism, where I look at how these organizations uncover the context of revelation. So looking at Asbabun Nuzul, right? And drawing ethical principles from that and applying it towards, drawing ethical principles of Islamic law and applying it towards current issues. So I argue that through my interviews, I mean, based on my interviews and through following the rhetoric that the organizations produce over time that I see these changes. But, right, these mechanisms that they employ vary in certain ways, vary in the puzzling ways that I've been talking about. They do not vary according to the theological foundations of which these Muslim women's organizations are affiliated with, right? They don't vary according to the particular streams of liberal and fundamental Islam. Instead, these inconsistencies vary through what I call point A, a cultural conception that links women's subjectivities to their motherhood roles and duties. And point B, an ethical legal model of marital justice that promotes women's rights as mothers' rights to receive physical and emotional protection. And so the data that I use for point A emerges directly out of the Muslim women's organizations, their magazines, their decisions about different fatwa issues, right? And the data from B looks at a more institutional process. And by institutions, I mean the institutions of Islamic courts in Indonesia and the Ministry of Religion. And so in this session, I'm just going to talk on point A. We can discuss point B later on in Q&A. So let's go straight to the issue of polygamy. So after Indonesia's independence, the women's movement lobbied for a marriage law. Without codified marriage law, women were vulnerable to male abuses because if men married without registering their marriage, women wouldn't be able to receive protection if the men were to divorce them. And if the men wanted to contract polygamous marriage, they can just do so and not be responsible towards their two wives, right? So before a 1974 marriage law was passed in Indonesia, Muslims married according to an amalgamation of customary and Islamic law practices based on the Shafi'i mazhab. So they were already marrying according to Shafi'i law and to a blend of customary practices. But that there was no codified marriage law until 1974. So in 1959, right, so the women's movement was discussing this, and the Muslim women's organizations wanted a marriage law as well. But what marriage law was it, right? And I compare in my dissertation 1937, 1959, and 1990s. And the comparison between 1959 and post-1998 is used because these are both periods of democracy in Indonesia. So you see a sense of coming to consensus between the arguments between secular groups and Islamic groups. Okay? So in 1959, the Indonesian parliament debated over two marriage bills. The details of the bills are there, but I want to focus on the polygamy aspect. Right, so the Somari bill is a private member bill, and it was represented, her bill represented the interests of the secular groups, the women's movement secular groups. And the marriage bill for Muslim that emerges out of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, that bill, it approved polygamy, but within restricted conditions, right? And within restricted conditions such that the husband had to show that he was financially capable of supporting more than one wife and getting an agreement from the wife. So there were two conditions tied to that. But the Somari bill said, no, marriage should be based on monogamy. Well, the bill was finally not decided. The parliament session broke for recess, and then in 1960, Sukarno reinstituted the 1945 constitution that gave him a lot of presidential powers, right? And so he dissolved the the parliament and the constituent assembly. These were the two forums in which decision making was made at a democratic level. And he dissolved that, and so since 1960 to 1998, Indonesia was an authoritarian and highly militaristic rule. Okay, so the Somari bill was supported by secular and non-Muslim women's groups. I've said that already. So in her introduction to the bill, Somari had described the contents of a marriage bill as one that should provide equal protection to men and women. So each Indonesian citizen, be it men or women, are entitled to demand for equal protection. And I want to highlight this last phrase here. One way to ensure that it is implemented is to stipulate for monogamy to become the basis of marriage. So what are we seeing here? Despite representing secular women's groups, Somari's understanding of women's rights is tied towards an idea that women's rights is based simultaneously on the principle of equality and the recognition for sexual difference. Now, this might seem as a commonsensical idea to us, right? But if you look at the sort of liberal women's rights perspective, the idea that women's rights, women's citizenship rights, is based on the idea that every individual, every human being is of equal dignity. So, and that is, and rooted within that idea is a secular mindset, where you privatize, you bracket differences, so that in the public domain, everyone is of equal dignity, and everyone then reserves equal rights. But Somari is saying, no, right? That the recognition for equal treatment is actually based on sexual difference, right? And so she says, mothers as the providers of complete and unconditional love, and fathers as the leaders of household and as protectors of the family, represents a model of a monogamous marriage, right? So she's saying that women are different from men, but yet at the same time we deserve equal rights under family protection. And so what is she invoking, right? And why is this a troubling implication? In the feminist scholarship, it is a troubling implication because it means that only mothers can then receive equal rights. What about non-married women? What about the rights of women who have kids but are not married, right? What about the rights of their children, of non-married women? So this is a troubling implication for feminist scholarship and for women in general who have children but somehow they form relationships and are somehow impregnated, and what happens to the rights of the child, right? So that's an issue. So according to Mrs. Somari, women deserve equal citizenship rights as men and hence equal protection for those rights under the law. At the same time, women, given their innate attributes as mothers, differ in terms of their political duties towards the state. In the 1950s, motherhood then became a strategic feminist strategy because maternal thinking became the shared metaphor and frame of reference between Muslim women's organizations and secular feminist groups. Both Muslim women's organizations and secular women's groups articulated an ideal family model to be one where a mother plays the nurturing role and a father protects and provides for the family. Mrs. Somari's perspective on polygamy, do I not have that? Yeah, okay. Her practice on polygamy reflected an engagement in Islamic doctrine. So they weren't just speaking, against each other. They were actually, the women's movement was actually engaging. And this is something new that I bring to the scholarship because when we look at the 1950s debate on marriage law in Indonesia, it seems as though, only the Muslim women's organizations were saying that they supported polygamy, and that as though the women's movement did not engage with Islam at all, which they did. So she says, in Islam, when a man is allowed to marry 4 wives, this should not be seen as the basis of marriage. In fact, it is an exception to the norm that is monogamy. And we see this argument being made now by the Muslim women's groups, right? And so she also quotes the Quran 4:3, right? And she then adds, reaffirming that equal treatment between men and women is based on recognition of sexual difference. So we see here a line that clearly says that it is clear that the main principle of marriage should be justice. It is a sin for a man to neglect his obligations towards his wife, that is to provide for her both financially and care for her emotions. Is it possible for a man to divide his love equally among 2, 3, 4 women? Okay, so these were the opinions of the secular women's groups then. What about the Muslim women's organization's stance on polygamy in the 1950s? How much time do I have? I'm sorry.
You have 15 minutes.
Excellent. Making good time. Okay, so according to Mahmoudi Mawarda from NU Muslimat, polygamy is not prohibited in Islam, but the law needs to severely punish men who wantonly abuse their rights, because this unregulated right will destroy families, and this is cursed upon by God. And she quotes this hadith from Abu Hurairah. And Juna Parjaman from Masyumi Muslimat, who's also a member of Aisha, basically states that polygamy is an option that can be taken when there is an emergency. I will discuss the changes in their opinions after. I'm gonna discuss it now. I'll discuss the changes in their opinions when I start discussing their present opinion on polygamy. Okay, so that you can see the difference. I just want to highlight a few things. So what I said about the changes between 1960s to 1998. So when Suharto came to power, he was the second authoritarian president after Sukarno. He came to power in 1966 until 1998. And I want to just summarize his policy on Islam, okay? And this is really quite a reduced version. But essentially, Suharto's policy on Islam was that he accommodated and supported Islamic piety and education, as well as co-opted Muslim organizations into an expanded Islamic bureaucracy. So you really see the Ministry of Religion expanding, and you also see the role of the Islamic courts strengthening. And in fact, in 1989, the Religious Promulgation Act was released that provided Islamic courts with executive powers to execute a decision. Before that, they could only advise. Okay, so I talk about that in my chapter, and we can talk about that later as well. So with this understanding in mind, I want to move on to what was Muslimat NU's position on polygamy after 1998. So in 2000, Muslimat NU came together in a congress in 2000. This was their 14th national congress. And Muslimat NU has since, in the late 1980s, I need to get the year right, but in the late 1980s formed their own committee for religious problem solving, right? And they call this Majlis Bastul Masail. I am not sure what that means in Arabic. Bastul Masail, right?
Discussing of issues.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So they call it Bastul Masail, and they convene to discuss several issues. And note that these meetings are separate from the NU's meetings. So these are separate forums that Muslim NU is coming together to talk about these issues, right? And they are talking about it in a way that's not restrained by the Committee for Religious Problem Solving in the male institution. Okay, so the format for this Congress is presented in a question and answer way. So the first question was, what is a form of legal protection accorded to a woman who enters a polygamous marriage that is not registered with the Office of Religious Affairs? Notice that there's this sort of question that is not registered with the Office of Religious Affairs. So they're trying to emphasize that, look, you need to register the marriage. The decision is lengthy and outlines first and foremost that polygamy is permissible but not unconditional, and they use the word mutlaq. Polygamy exists as an option only in a state of emergency. The declaration is followed by a lengthy elaboration of Surah An-Nisa 4:1-9. And you will never be able to be equal in feeling between wives, even if you should strive to do so. Subsequently, they cite the hadith that states, for the same hadith basically, they cite the same hadith by Abu Hurairah. For he who has more than one wife and treats either one unfairly, he will appear during the day of reckoning with half of his body tilted to one side. The answer to that question then definitely states in bold. So note that they use the same surah, they use the same hadith, but they come to a different conclusion, right? And this conclusion is based on Quranic verse and hadith above. It is to be understood that monogamy is the basis of marriage. And this is phenomenal for Muslimat NU, because Muslimat NU is seen in Indonesia as always following what NU states. right? Because they come from a traditionalist organization, and for them to say this is phenomenal because they did not say this in the 1950s. So, and they say something else which was really striking to me. Subsequently, the decision then lays out the 4 permissible reasons for polygamy. First, if a wife is ill and is unable to carry out wifely responsibilities. Second, if a husband is hypersexual and is not sexually satisfied by just one wife. Third, if a wife is medically certified as barren. Fourth, if a husband is fair to his wives and is able to provide equally to their peace of mind and welfare. And they have made that in bold, right? Peace of mind. I don't know how, like, that means it's impossible. Okay, but anyway, they were trying to push towards that direction, but obviously they couldn't see that, that it's not, polygamy is not permissible. So at the same time, the decision interestingly states, if a husband in the situation as set out in the first, second, and third points, that means if the wife is ill, the wife is barren, and the husband is hypersexual, a wife is allowed to seek for court-regulated divorce. And so here they're using the 1974 marriage law to substantiate women's right to seek divorce, right? And so you see how they're pursuing marriage law within an Islamic framework, but then is substantiating that right based on state law. So it's incredible. So the next question in the same section asks, and this is another section that I was so blown away by, right? Is polygamy considered a solution to mitigate and reduce the rate of prostitution? So this question speaks to a prevailing perception amongst Islamic religious scholars of NU and Muhammadiyah. In the 1959 marriage law debates, one of the several reasons justifying polygamy revolved around male lust. And this is a quote from one of the parliamentarians from Muslimat NU. Because men are of different nature and have different levels of lust, it is difficult for men to keep to one wife. To avoid fulfilling men's desire through seeking companionship from prostitutes, Islam does not prohibit men from having 2 or more wives to meet his needs. Okay? So in response to this prevalent mindset, they didn't respond in 1959, right? They didn't. And they're responding now in 2000. In response to this prevalent mindset, Muslimat NU declared, Muslimat NU rejects such an argument because the solution to mitigate lustful desires and to refrain from fornication is to abide by the law of God and to follow the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad. The Hadith states, young men, those among you who can support a wife, should marry, for it restrains eyes from casting evil glances and preserves one from immorality. But those who cannot should devote themselves to fasting, for it is a means for controlling sexual desire. So, in the decision above, Muslimat NU alerts women to her right to seek divorce under certain conditions should her husband exercise his right to engage in polygamy. These conditions, as quoted in the passage above, are similar to the permissible grounds of divorce, as listed in the government regulations accompanying the 1974 marriage law. So, according to Muslimat NU's decision, should a wife not relent to the husband's desire of polygamous marriage, she can choose to divorce him. And this option to leave the marriage and abrogate one's wifely duties places the women's happiness, welfare, and freedom as one of the primary goals of marriage, above her motherhood duties and obligations to her husband. Now, in the chapter I discuss how this, because remember, this is a decision that they came to in the Bastul Messiah, right? And whether or not they implement this decision is something else. And so in my conversations with Muslimat NU women, it appears that, it really is a case-to-case basis. If the women had young children, they would still advise her to say, look, you have this choice, but think about your children. Okay, so I want to point out and I want to show the difference that in 1950s they just didn't have the tools to make this kind of claim that they are making now. Okay, so Muslimat NU has developed an understanding of women's rights that has evolved since the 1950s. During the 1950s, demands for women's rights to equal treatment were espoused by secular women's groups. Muslimat NU made demands for the protection of women's welfare as provided under Islamic law, as they still do now. Muslimat NU had highlighted the principles of justice and fairness in the treatment of wives and orphans as stated in Quran verse 4.3 and 4.129. In the 1950s, Muslimat NU perceived the criteria for fairness and justice that was transmitted during a particular period as universal truth. So they looked at 4.144129 and they used those criteria for justice and fairness and applied it to their present time, right? So the cultural specificity, my mouth is dry. So the cultural specificity of revelation delivered to urban Arabs living within a tribal and patriarchal culture was not as much directly accepted as it was not critically examined. The tools needed to develop a contextual analysis of Islamic doctrine were unavailable to women of Muslimat NU in the 1950s. Instead, the application of the principles of justice underlying polygamous marriages in Indonesia were based on a criteria that was specific to the cultural, political, and linguistic surroundings of Arabian society. But at the same time, Muslimat NU in the 1950s looked outside of Islamic doctrine and appealed to women's rights to be protected by virtue of their naturalized duties, birthing and nurturing to the state. Hence, Muslim women sought for protection of women's welfare, not only within an Islamic framework, but also in ways that were commensurate with their madhab duties for the state. And we move now to present, right? The present time. So presently, the development of the human rights discourse has impacted the doctrinal interpretation of Muslimat NU. And it has done so in ways that promotes their independence in determining the outcome of marriage. Women of Muslimat NU conclude that polygamy is only acceptable under the conditions of personal emergency. They call it darura, individual being personal, individual. By applying the principles of justice into current Indonesian context, Muslimat NU notes that it is highly impossible for Muslim men who practice polygamy to be fair towards multiple wives. While this was a similar assertion made in the 1950s, presently Muslimat NU women have looked at other verses and engaged with a gender equality, with a gender interpretation that promotes gender equality within the Quran and Hadith to reinforce their argument. So again, they now have those tools, right? For example, as I discussed, they emphasize the Quranic passages in Hadith that teaches men to restrict their sexual urges and practice discipline. And that to promote public morality and build healthy families, the solution is not only for women to be good mothers, but the solution, according to Muslimat NU, is not to condone polygamy. Instead, men should control their sexual appetites through pious acts like fasting and praying. And I end here. I wanted to go on about the other organization, but again, we can talk about that later. But the other organization that I look into actually applies the third mechanism that I was talking about, the application of Islamic principles into present-day context. And with that, thank you.
Thanks.